Hyvää iltapäivää kaikki. Tervetuloa takaisin Finnish Energy Day. I leave the Finnish there. So, welcome. It's a privilege to welcome you back to Finnish Energy Day on 2022. We are so happy that we could be here this fall. I also wish to thank our good partners, Axpo, Nordpool, Epic Spot, Fortum, ABN AMRO, and Climate Link Up. Thank you for your support, which makes us able to host this event here in Helsinki this fall. Next year, we aim, of course, to make the similar event as we have had earlier years, with a June event and a dinner cruise in the lovely surroundings outside Helsinki. So, we are here today with a very serious situation in Europe and the world as a whole. We will talk about the energy crisis that has met us, and we will talk about how Finland will cope with this. Will there be enough electricity here this winter? We'll look about the power prices in detail, and also the effects on new power supply with Olkiluoto 3, and we will go deeply more into the gas crisis and what that affects both Finland and the Baltic areas. And finally, at the end of the day, we'll talk about green markets, PPAs, and the development of the carbon market as well. But before we do that, I also wish to have this opportunity to say some few words about Montel. Since we haven't met since before the pandemic, and we have developed quite rapidly as well, also during the last 2.5 years. And not only serving you with news and data, but also now doing more on analytics, so that you can get more insights into what is driving the prices and what is actually going on, and get feedback also from our good analysts and advisory services in what drives what these days. We have also purchased a company in Germany called PriceIt, who are doing risk management tools and hourly price forward curves for the energy markets. And we have also started to now really develop our AI solutions for power plant predictions and also price predictions using AI. And together with Energy Quantified, our fundamental analytics arm, we are hosting more data also now to the market. The last initiative we did this spring was Montel Marketplace, a trading platform for handling guarantees of origin. So if you want to do more on that, please don't hesitate to contact Miratoria Sugai. She's in the back there, and she will teach you all about the Montel Marketplace. And we are able to do this because we now have a good partner, or strong partner in Montel, which really support us to do the new things, following the development in the energy markets, doing more on short-term trading, serving our clients with the relevant data and correct data and Q data, so that you are able to sustain and improve in a very difficult market. And Riverside did this partnership with us during this summer, and it really helps us to further develop the services that you are so used to use. So I hope that you will find our development also fruitful for you in the time to come. By that, we go deeper into the topics of the day. And Olav, here is a very interesting program, and I leave the floor over to you.
Yes, thank you, Morten. I'm glad that so many of you turned up today. It's been a very dramatic market development over the last year. It's getting even more dramatic every week, as we saw this week with all the explosions in the Baltic Sea. But we will separate it in two. We will start with the electricity, the power market, and then we will go to the gas market in the next session. The first one, we will go into the security of supply situation here in Finland with Jukka Ruusunen, who is the CEO of Fingrid. And then it will be followed up by a fundamental price outlook from Volue and Olav Botnen, who will give us his views on what will happen to the prices. And then we will go to a discussion about the new power supply coming online. What will come? Will it be wind? Will it be solar, nuclear? Discussion between Anni Mikkonen of the Finnish Energy Wind Power Association, and Lari Järvenpää of Fortum. And then we will have a coffee break before we go over to the second session of today, which is gas, where Trevor Sikorski is coming from Energy Aspects, give us his update on the fundamental, even what's happening now with the prices, with the supply situation in Europe and the world as well. Very, very exciting. And of course, what will be the implications then for the local market in Finland and the Baltic region? We will have Jouni Liimatta of Gasum, who will give us his view on the more local market impact. Before the last break, and then we will finish off with a green session on the renewable markets, where Mats Larsson will come from Expo and talk about the PPA market. What is the conditions now for getting investments in new renewables? We will also have a view, an outlook on the EU ETS and the reforms that we see now in Brussels, and how that impacts the market demand for emission allowances with Uti Hampera of Sitra. So that's it. I hope we will all have a nice day. I think we could just go straight on the first presentation with Jukka Ruusunen of Fingrid.
Yes, thank you. Strange days, strange days. I mean, I never thought that in my career I would work in the middle of a war, but here we are. That was not one of my forecasts, not even a scenario, an extreme scenario, but this is where we are at the moment. I'm coming directly from Fingrid's offices. We had an exercise training for a 1-week blackout in the Helsinki metropolitan area. So my mindset is a little bit black now. I mean, if you start to think about a blackout in the middle of a winter time in a city like that, that stuff, nothing works. And even our government, and they have to take care of how they lead the country in these kinds of situations. But it's also good because we have a mentality in Finland to be prepared. And that's why Fingrid sent a warning signal about the coming winter already in August, which we have never done before, never. Normally, we give the winter outlook in October or November, but now we thought that now we have to give the signal so that the society can prepare. I mean, everybody, companies, authorities, ordinary people, and now we can see what kind of a country this is, because we see now a lot of preparations for the coming winter, whatever may come. Last year, actually, we didn't know, but the war had started. And we were making our sort of normal estimations of the coming winter. And I can show you how it looked like. Finland has all through the past years, for many years, been a deficit country when it comes to peak demand. We have been dependent on imports from our neighboring countries. And last year, the deficit was minus 3,800 megawatts even.
It's okay?
Yeah. And we said that this is business as usual, because we thought that we are able to import if there is a deficit, then there is also electricity available in our neighbor countries, one of them being Russia. Very reliable supplier of electricity during the past years, the past decades. And then something happened. Then the real war started. And then it was not Russia who stopped the electricity exports to Finland. It was the European Union, and we together who prevented Russian electricity of entering into Finland and into European Union. And now that import possibility is gone. That's the change. So now we make a new estimate of the coming winter, what might come without the import from Russia, and then tight situation in all the countries around the Baltic Sea. Quite tight. So now the new numbers are like this. The peak demand in Finland, 15,100 megawatts, which was the consumption, if I remember correctly, 8th of January 2016. And then from the generation it has been a little bit difficult to estimate, because in spring when the Russian import stopped, we said no problem, because Olkiluoto 3 will replace it. It will run. At that time the estimated time of arrival of Olkiluoto 3 was August, if I remember correctly, during summertime. But now we have seen new timetables, and the latest date is now in December, and that is already the winter period. Then there are in this generation number, now we have been talking about the strategic reserves mainly. One power plant called Meripori, it's included now in the generation. But we have also read from the media that that's not necessarily available for long periods of time. And then in that number we have estimated, when we do stress testing, something like 5% of the wind power available. Wind power capacity, when we talk about January, for example, close to 5,000 megawatts. But unfortunately, when it's extremely cold, it's normally also quite calm. And that's the balance, 2,200 megawatts. We can say, I mean, problem solved, no problem. And then we have the interconnections. The import capacity is more than 3,000 megawatts. So why worry? And when we go to all these factors, then you start to think about, I have taken these 3 points to think about. Is the deadline for Olkiluoto 3 for sure? A delay of 3 months, 2-3 months, and then the winter is gone. We don't have that capacity. And we have seen a lot of delays in that project. Can we rely that this is the final date? Then it's the Swedish situation. Very tight situation, and Sweden is from our point of view divided into northern Sweden and southern Sweden, and the tight situation is especially in the south. Ringhals 4 out of operation to the end of January, for example. North looks better. And then also to the Baltic countries. If they can manage by themselves, it's good. But we are not expecting a lot of imports from that. The biggest variation comes from weather. When it comes to rain, when it comes to wind, when it comes to temperature and consumption. And I will show you some examples of what might happen and what are behind these numbers. What kind of winters can we see in this country? First, nose on the surface. That's the basic scenario. It means that it's -25 in this area, Helsinki area. Most of the consumption in Finland is in the south, so this is not sort of the average temperature in Finland. It's especially the temperature in the south. Helsinki -25, almost calm. You can imagine that kind of a winter day. It's not an extreme, but it's pretty cold. 1 in 10 years, you could say. Peak demand then, we go back to year 2016, 15,100 megawatts. If we don't do anything, this is without measures, said that we are preparing, this is without measures. Olkiluoto 3, optimistic, running. And then wind generation, as I said, out of 5,000 megawatts, we give 300 to the generation part. And then, if we want to have the nose on the surface, we should get 2,200 megawatts from Sweden. So it means full capacity, 1,200 from the north, might happen, but then we have to rely that there is electricity in the southern parts of Sweden as well, 1,000 megawatts. The capacity of the Fennoskan lines in the south is 1,200. So almost full import in Sweden, and then we have nose on the surface, and we will survive. And then they say, Jukka, why did you say that there is a problem? Because there was none. Breathe freely. The average 10-year, if we take the or even the median during the past years, temperature in Helsinki area close to 17. I took 17 because that's the average. Engineers want to have exact numbers. And then we give a little bit wind in this scenario. Might be more wind than in the extreme cold. Peak demand now 14,000, like we have seen, measured without extra measures when it comes to consumption. Olkiluoto 3 running, and then wind, 1,400 megawatts out of 5,000. I don't know whether that's optimistic or pessimistic, but if there's some wind, you could easily get that. And then in this picture, we wouldn't need any imports. And if we import, like from Sweden, northern Sweden, we could even export to the Baltic countries, which probably would like to have reasonably priced electricity to that area. And then we would be in balance. So, and then as said, that probably there is an import opportunity as well, but that would balance. If we would import 1,200 megawatts via the northern lines, we would only need 200 megawatts of wind. And here you see, I mean, it's pretty much about weather, what's going to happen next winter. So if you want to know the situation, follow the weather forecasts. And when we approach minus 20 or more minus degrees, then the situation starts to get tight, whether we have Olkiluoto 3 or not. And then the problematic situation. Olkiluoto 3 delayed from the winter period, just 2-3 months, not a long delay, but for out of operation next winter. Some issues in the project. No wind generation or very little wind generation. Calm weather, this normal minus 25. Again, peak demand, 15,100. And then imports from the northern part of Sweden, but now we can give more capacity to the north because we don't have Olkiluoto 3. That takes 300 megawatts from the northern lines. We have to reserve 300 megawatts just for this one power plant when that's in operation. And then we have the deficit 2,600 megawatts. And if you look at the profile, which happened 2016, we would have forced outages 24 hours during these days. This is not just we restrict consumption during peak hours, but peak hours is every hour, without measures to the consumption. And somebody might even think that this can happen. And if we are not prepared, what happens? And what can we do? If I would be a politician, I would say build a new nuclear power plant as fast as possible so that it's ready next winter. And problem solved. But the only thing we can now have an impact on is the consumption side. And that's why all the measures done that we don't use electricity if that is not necessary, that's the best way going forward. But this is the stress test. People think that next winter, if there are these forced outages 2 hours per day, this is rotating sort of outages all the time. And if this takes something like 2 weeks, there might be some news in the media. This is the tough case. And then the future, you are going to discuss about that as well. So how we think in Fingrid at the moment that one eye is looking at the ball, where it is, and solving this crisis. And we are putting a lot of hours, our people, how we can cope with the next winter and the current situation. But at the same time, the other eye is looking forward, like where the ball is going. And that's much more positive. And you are going to hear about that. But we are building sort of lines all the time, substations all the time, so our investment program is running full speed, no delays. All that we have promised to deliver have been delivered, and we have good plans to go forward, and we are going to have more and more generation and electrification in this country going forward. So there is light in the tunnel, and a lot of light in the tunnel going forward. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jukka. Very interesting, also very scary in many ways. The problems there. How can you prepare? What kind of measures do you take to cut consumption to avoid getting these peak demand figures that you showed us?
I think what is now happening in the preparation is that we have to see where we can have an impact, and that's the consumption side. And it's ordinary people plus industry. And now the message is there that avoid any extra consumption, especially during the winter time. So that's the measure. And then, if something happens, be prepared for these outages and take care at your home and also in the industries. But now nobody can say that this is a surprise.
How confident are you that Olkiluoto 3 will deliver a stable generation over the winter period?
I hope that it will, but you never know. And you know, it's one of the biggest power plants in the world, and there have been delays in this project all the time. And then it's not only that you build the power plant and it's running, but it has to be integrated to the power system as well. And all the technical huge projects have their risks. It's just normal risk. So there is a risk, I see, and we have to take care of it. We cannot just hope that everything goes well.
Oh, that's right. I mean, if you said at the end there about the future, can you have any advice to the power producers, the politicians, on how to design the production mix going forward? Are you afraid that there will be too much wind, too much solar at the expense of base load, or can you cope also with a much higher wind power penetration?
Yeah, the wind power penetration is big, and now we see bigger and bigger also project coming from the solar side and asking for the connection, and luckily also electrification projects now. More and more this project, and it's easier to talk about generation because these are sort of public projects, but then there's also a lot happening behind the scenes when it comes to consumption and electrification of this country. We just have to take care of this, and we have a lot of plans, for example, how to manage this electricity system with a smaller amount of rotating mass. We have Nordic project solving that. So it's very similar problems that engineers are solving all over the world. And we can solve this problem if we just want. But we must find the solutions from the future, not from the past.
I think we have time for one or two questions also from the audience. There is this one.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Katri. I'm energy buyer and trying to understand whether there will be something to buy. My question is, did I understand correctly that you're using the data from 2016 to estimate your peak consumption?
That was just a case when that happened, but we make the forecast, of course, based on the information that we have at the moment, and this is something that we are going to update during the autumn period to see how these measures have an impact on the demand when now the message is out that you should reduce it. Now we start to see the first numbers, but this 15,000 has been the peak demand forecast for some years already.
Okay, so in the last years the peak demand was not adjusted. I personally don't know enough, to be honest with you, about electrification projects in Finland. I also don't know about how the consumption has changed. I'm only asking if the number still holds from 2016.
No, it's not that number, but that's the scenario when it happens, and then it's easier to take you back to that weather, that wind situation. That's just for the scenario. But we are upgrading our forecast when it comes to demand all the time, because we have to manage the system in real time. But it seems that there has been some reductions already now. And then, of course, we are going to adjust them, and then also have to estimate what is the price impact on the demand in the winter time. But because now it can be stronger than before, it can be, but we don't have numbers, we don't have any time series concerning that.
How do you see a possibility? The company where I'm working, we have faced some regulations in other countries where we were told, in case of a consumption reduction, which this is a scenario, and we were told how much we will have to cut the consumption of our industries. How do you see this possibility in Finland of somebody coming to a plant and saying use 20% less?
Yeah, the first is that Finnish companies are very actively working in the market, and that has been the tradition, energy-intensive industry, for example. So they do this, just following the price development. So the big industries is on board, and they are also thinking about other measures at the moment. We have quite a lot of dialogue with them as well. And then the smaller industry has started to follow, and there has been even some sort of banking companies and now also service providers and others who say that they start to reduce the consumption. And then before anything starts to happen, we are going to inform this country something like that tomorrow it is a tight situation, we encourage you to consume less. And then if we are forced, because demand and supply must be in balance in electricity, then we are forced to make these outages. And this is what we do with the distribution companies, because then they are doing these outages in their areas, because they know them better than Fingrid. Fingrid could cut some, two big areas if we would start to cut that away. And now we are sort of seeing that we have all these processes in place. Who are going to warn? How are these distribution companies going to inform ordinary consumers and so forth? So that was the reason that we wanted to give this society time to prepare. And we see that we need this time. We thought that everything is ready, and companies said that everything is ready, but it's not. Just check the preparedness plans of various organizations. They are more Word documents than real plans.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think that's it. If you don't have any more questions, I think we are good. So thank you very much for your presentation, and we just move to the next slide with the market analysis.
And we also have a present for you. Thank you.
Yes, and then Olav Botnen will present his view on how this market situation, what will happen to prices both in Finland and the rest of the Nordic power market.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back in Finland after the pandemic situation. But now we are into an even worse situation than under the pandemic, I think. I will present our price forecast, which is very fresh, released yesterday evening, in fact. But first we will start out with the situation as it is now. And it's quite terrible due to this Russian reductions of gas to Europe. And I think there's only one solution to this problem with the gas, is some degree of demand destruction, which will make the balance in the end during this winter. We have also been into a very low wind situation throughout all of Europe, so to say. We have seen low levels of precipitation nearly all over Europe, extremely low levels. And that means low hydropower reservoirs, and it means also low river levels in Germany, for instance. And we have low nuclear production due to all the French nuclear problems, but also due to low river levels, which make it difficult to be online for all of these reactors. So the results until this end August or so, extremely high prices for the coming winter and for the coming year. And gas-fired generation is on the price margin nearly all over Europe. So now we are heading into somewhat different going forward. First of all, LNG is now arriving to Europe in quite large amounts. And there are some import terminals on its way into Europe, floating most of them. We have seen gas storage levels has coming up significantly, 2 months earlier than predicted from the EU. We have seen river levels which are now normalized in Germany, which make it possible to have the coal into their coal-fired plants again as normal. We see that wind and temperatures are also back to normal levels, and more generation is now coming back to Germany from the wind power. And also some nuclear stations are back in business in France. So we also have a situation where the EU market has come into a more bearish territory after hitting 100 euros per ton just 1 month ago. We see that some front loading might find its way to this market, and we see reduced demand for this EURs, and we see also a potential industrial sell-off coming into practice. But the main thing going forward for the winter is significant reduction of demand for both gas and electricity. And we have already seen a lot of it, but more is to be observed during this winter when everybody is starting for the heating season just in some days' perspective. And I think this demand destruction will be the main focus of this winter all over Europe. So here is some variations from the gas market lately. We have seen all-time high coming up every second month or so lately. And that's also the situation now. We are not at the top anymore, but somewhere below the top. And Nord Stream 1 fears is probably the main driver here, but also other things related to Russia has speeded up those prices significantly, and the balance cannot be fixed inside of Europe when you had 1,800 terawatt-hours of gas energy streaming in from Russia, which is not there anymore. 1,800 terawatt-hours is way off too much to find a way to balance out without demand destruction. So we don't think that rationing will be the case, but more demand destruction due to prices and due to activities being reduced in the industries and in the households and in the service sectors. But there are also risks, of course, if the cold winter arrives, and you never know when it arrives. And also this Ukraine transit problem might occur. We know already now that there are some disputes between Ukraine and Russia about payments for this transportation through Ukraine. And that is the last resort when it comes to Russian gas to Europe now, after Nord Stream 1 and 2 is out of business for a long period. Next year seems a little bit more relaxed because we will see more Algerian gas exports to Europe. We will see more LNG terminals, and we will also see EU's renewable targets more and more into the flesh. Here is a chart telling about the LNG flowing into Europe. It's probably an all-time high during the summer. Very healthy levels of LNG imports to Europe. And that's also one of the main factors for reservoirs or storages coming up to nearly 90% nowadays. And as this slide also tells, there's a lot of floating new import terminals on its way. And some of them have already started operations in Netherlands, for instance, and 3-4 of them will come up also in Germany and Estonia. Here is a slide about demand destruction in Germany and UK and Italy and Netherlands and Spain altogether. For Germany, we see the gas consumption down approximately 15% so far compared to last year. And it's related both to buildings, to households and industries. But probably so far this year, industry is the main contributor. But when winter comes, probably we'll see more contribution also from households, public buildings and service sectors. So a little dive into the EUA market. This repower plans, which has been released lately from the EU, might give some extra wind and solar going forward. The targets are very strong. Now we have like 136 gigawatt of renewable electricity by 2020. We are diving up to 320 just by 2025, and up to 600 gigawatt by 2030. It's extremely big plans, and front loading is the way to finance some of the subventions to get there. So the EU has now proposed one-off release of maybe 200 to 250 million tons in the front years in this market, and that will help a lot for a more bearish development in this market. And this also raised the cash for this repower plan. Additionally, we will see more reduction of the EU demand in Europe when industrials reduce their activities, for instance, and also if electricity consumption is coming down. That also will help EUA demand downwards. And there's also an industrial sell-off risk going into this winter. If any industrials are coming into some kind of liquidity problem, there's an easy fix for it by selling free allocated EURs into the market, like they did in 2008. At that time, prices started at 25, ended at 8 euros. We might see something similar if this is coming into the flesh this winter, with a lot of liquidity trouble in the industries. We have a forecast ourselves. Yesterday it was 65 by end October and 60 by end 2023. Today it's reduced down to 60 also for the front end. So 60 euros is our forecast here now, assuming no industrial sell-off. Any industrial sell-off will, of course, come into consideration if it comes. Here is an illustration of the renewable growth rate as it were in history and as it is expected to be going forward. The level of new renewables is going to be doubled to reach the targets in the EU. when we're talking about EUA emissions to the market, unfortunately, it increased quite significantly in 2021 with all this coal-fired generation starting up activity again instead of going into a mothball position. This year we will see a little bit track downwards with reduction of demand being the main driver, even with restart of even more coal-fired generation, and even when we include nuclear decommissioning effects in Europe. And next year will probably be even much lower when it comes to emissions due to demand reductions and demand destructions. So emissions is coming down, but first it came up due to the restart of coal-fired generation and also in combination with nuclear decommissioning. Now moving over to the Nordic market, which all of us are included in. We have a splitted Nordic market nowadays, more splitted than ever when it comes to pricing at least, and also bottleneck problems all over. And the Swedish SE3 is the main problematic zone here due to Ringhals 1 and 2 decommissioning, which took place a couple of years ago. So normally SE3 was the transfer center of the Nordic. It's not anymore. This is a really bottleneck situation there now, which is also affecting Norway and Finland and Denmark. And nowadays, Norway has lost a lot of the flow from Sweden and into Norway. That means south of Norway is now in a locked-in position with 5,300 megawatt of cable link capacity to Europe, on its own with it, without any help from any other areas, because the northernmost part of Norway down to the south is very weak. It's only 400 or 500 megawatt at the best, and that's nothing compared to the oversupply in the north. And a similar situation in Sweden with the bottleneck between SE2 and SE3, very strong bottleneck, and we have a huge oversupply in the north, which cannot find its way to the south. And we also have a bottleneck problem from Finland into SE3. If Finland wants to export the Olkiluoto 3 power, there's no room for it on the link because SE3 cannot take anymore in that end of SE3. So that's also a problem. So in total, it's a problematic Nordic situation all over. And all these price areas are left alone with their balance. And in north, we have a huge oversupply which cannot find its way to the market. In north of Sweden, we assume approximately 20 terawatt hours of oversupply of wind power generation. It takes a lot of years until it might find a way to the market in a proper way. That will happen with more consumption in north, but also with more links coming to the south. But it comes a little bit later all of it, so it will be 2, 3, 4 years with oversupply, which is overwhelming in that price zone. Same also for north of Norway, which have like 7, 8 terawatt hours of oversupply in the very northernmost part of Norway. And those two parts of Scandinavia is very closely linked to each other. So those problems add when it comes to oversupply in north. And we nearly have opposite direction, opposite situation in south of Scandinavia, unfortunately. A little bit into the power balance here in Finland when it comes to energy, not to capacity and balance situation in the short term, but more in an annual resolution way. We are now into a very strong change in the energy balance of Finland when Olkiluoto finally start up with full speed, and a lot of wind farms is also coming into the market simultaneously, and we will also have some marginal demand destruction here. So that means we will go from a net import situation to Finland of more than 20 terawatt hours to a nearly balanced situation when it comes to energy terms. So by 2023, it's more or less in balance with itself. No net imports or exports. before we take prices into consideration. So it's wind which will come up to 18 terawatt hours instead of 7 just a couple of years ago. It's Olkiluoto 3 coming into the market fully by 2023, and it's quite stable consumption level. And there's also some reduced CHP and thermal generation, which is the opposite way. So we have a very slow consumption growth here in Finland compared to what we have in Sweden and Norway. So we have not that optimistic view when it comes to electrification here as in Sweden, with all these new industries in the north, for instance. But there's also two other things which has happened after the Russian war started. Finland have now nothing from Russia anymore. They had a flow of 8 terawatt hours per year annually, which was off-peak hours mostly. That's gone. And we also lost one project which was meant in 2029, the Fennovoima project, which has been shut down. So the balance has changed in significant ways, and that means when this Fennovoima doesn't come into the market, we see a negative balance post-2030 also in Finland. However, it's still something to do here with wind farms probably. So maybe wind farms will increase even more to fill the gap from Fennovoima, or maybe we'll also see another nuclear project coming up in Finland. We don't know yet. Here is a list of all new developments when it comes to grid inside of the Nordic. And as you can see, there's a lot of north-south. Most of it is north-south related, in fact, when it comes to internal grid expansions here in the Nordic. And it's worth mentioning that Finland will connect even more with SE1. And also, if the Fennoskan project is to be started in 2030, it will also be connected to SE2 instead of SE3 as it is now with the existing Fennoskan link. So, going into the hydrological situation. Well, there's a lack of 12 terawatt hours in the south of Norway, and Norway has a quite tough situation with very low hydro situation going into winter, and there's not room for any kind of exports anymore. Norway, south of Norway is more likely to import instead of export going forward this winter. And we already seen 1 terawatt hour or so of net imports to south of Norway this September. So the things have changed significantly for south of Norway after connecting so closely to Europe. In Sweden, nearly a normal reservoir situation there. A little bit higher than normal in north, a little bit lower in the south, but in total nearly normal. Now I'm going to present the simulation results from yesterday. It's worth mentioning that we have reduced consumption by approximately 12 terawatt hours compared to last year. That's 3% of reduction of demand, and that is in fact a very conservative thought when it comes to demand reduction. I had a look into 2008 to 9. There we saw 6% of demand reduction, like 24 terawatt hours in the Nordic. So I think 24 is also too low in this situation. So we will see a new level which had never been observed any time in history going into this next year. So it's a hopeless guess to come with a good forecast for demand destruction going into this winter. It's impossible to come up with a forecast, in fact. So we have started in a very conservative way here, only 3% compared to last year. But it's worth mentioning that last year also had some demand reductions. The households started reduction already in last winter in Norway, because prices came up significantly from September last year onwards. And it's also worth mentioning that when we do our midterm price forecast, we put the EEX traded prices into a model directly as the average price for representing Germany, but with weather spread also there. So here is the prices we have put in from the EEX market yesterday when we did simulation work. So system price forecasts. Our average prices for this winter from simulation at system price level is 245 and 280 approximately, which is significantly lower than the market as it is yesterday at closing. But we also see a weather spread which starts at 150 something, ends up at 450. So I think if you look into those spreads, we see that the market has a very pessimistic winter view. Expect a cold winter effect, or maybe it's a risk premium we are talking about. If you have a look at the frontier, it's in line with our forecast, very nice in line. If you look into the next years, our simulation is much higher than the market. And that's also due to the situation with a lot of risk premiums from the German market spreading also into the Nordic market. And we see quite a strong weather spread for the frontier from approximately 100 up to 300 something. So in total we see sell signals for the winter and quite neutral signal for the year and also for the Q2 next year. And it's bullish signals for the rest of the curve. However, then it's already included a lot of risk premiums for Germany and also in the gas market. The Finnish area price forecast is probably even more to the point for all of you. There we see even more bearish signals for the Q4 and Q1 contracts. But it also, of course, includes full speed at Olkiluoto 3. If that doesn't come, then the results will be totally different. But anyway, it's quite bearish if we include Olkiluoto continuously throughout this winter. We see that the simulated price for Q1 is less than half of the market price as we see it there. And the spread is not coming up to the level from the market at all. And if you look into 2023, it's also quite a bearish signal there, with more than 55 euros gap between our simulation at average weather compared to the market situation. And even the spread doesn't go as high in the simulations as the market is for Finland. But of course, those market prices, I don't know whether they are to rely on or not, because those market prices are not liquid at all. So it's illiquid market situation for the Finnish area price, probably. So this is only taken out of the closing prices of yesterday, but probably at no liquidity for a lot of those projects, or products, I mean. And we also see bullish signals for the year after 2023. However, that's also related to the bullish input from EEX with risk premiums on top of the prices there. So here is all areas relevant in this situation in the Nordic area. So we see the northernmost areas have a very low price through all the periods, and the more populated areas in the south has much higher prices, with south of Norway being the highest one in our part of Scandinavia at least. Denmark is of course even a little bit higher, as it is nearly one-to-one linked with the EEX prices. And Lithuania is also very high, and also the Baltic countries in total are quite high, and higher than Finland, and also higher than SF4. And in some products even higher than Norway too, south of Norway. So this shows how big the spread is between all the price areas nowadays. It's totally split. I have done an alternative system price forecast with putting in our own simulation results for continental Europe instead of the traded ones. The traded ones include quite huge, large risk premium. It's like 200 for of that risk premium is like 200 for the year, and even higher for the Q1 and Q4, and only 10 to 20 euros for the 2024 and onwards. So when we put that into our model, much lower German prices, much lower Dutch prices, much lower UK prices, we see bearish signal, significantly bearish signals for 2023, and more or less neutral or slightly bullish for the years thereafter. Going into another alternative Finnish area price done in the same way with our simulation results from EX instead of the traded prices from EX, then we see a strong bearish signal both for 2023 for Finland and also 2024. And even a little bit of bearish also for 2025, and neutral for 2026. But please be aware of the thing that we have not included yet strong demand destruction. If that comes, everything is turning bearish and the risk premiums will fall to nothing and even go negative. So it's worth mentioning that demand destruction will be the key for this winter. And we don't know whether it will be 3, 6, 10 or 15 or 20%. We have already observed a demand destruction in households in Norway of 20% in households, even with a strong support from the government on the pricing. So demand destruction is the key, and you have probably already heard aluminium industries in Norway reducing activity from 1st of October by 250 megawatt in total. That's only a start, probably. We will see more, quite a lot more. And we don't know anything about service sectors yet. But in Norway, the support system for service sector is very low, and we expect a lot of demand destruction and bankruptcies and whatever in that sector. I don't know how it is here in Finland about the service sector, but I think we will see a lot of bankruptcy, a lot of demand destruction in the service sector, and also in households, and a lot of reductions in industry, which is more or less temporary for this winter, probably. And we don't know yet how many of the industrials have sold out any kind of hedged volumes they had previously for when we entered this Q4 in just a couple of days. So I think we will see the really test in the first weeks of October how this industrial response to the high prices will be. And that will be a very interesting observation to see in the flesh what kind of demand destruction we are heading into. Because we have never seen prices like this any time in history. And it will also give a strong response, I suggest. More than 6% as we saw on the financial crisis. So I hope that we will still be in business, all of us, next time I will see you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, thanks, Olav. It's of course very difficult times to analyze any price, future prices. But you said the demand development will probably be the key price driver. What is the weather scenario if you look back to the impact from the southern Norwegian drought there? Is it any? Do you see any normalization there that can sort of bring down the system price and the general Nordic price level?
Yes, of course, demand destruction will only be available in southern Norway. There's no incentives in the north. So I suggest we will see a lot of reduction in all the prices in Norway going forward, especially on the Q1 and rest of Q4. That will be the main impact. After that, probably the gas situation is much easier in Europe, and prices have come down in the EEX area when we enter 2024. Probably when we see a lot of LNG streaming in to Europe again and helping to avoid any problems. I didn't catch all of your question. Can you?
No, it was more about the weather situation, the hydropower reservoir levels. I mean, they are very low. Do you see much room for improvement? We are approaching the winter quite quickly, so is the season lost in a way? We have to manage with low levels for the rest of this year.
Yes, I think first of all, now we see that the water values has come up to European levels in southern Norway. So that means that it will be a lot of imports anytime wind power is coming up in Germany. Then we will see a lot of imports. And we will see also this demand destruction I talked about in the aluminium industry, for instance. So only the aluminium industry will push up the spring culmination, let's say 3%. Only that aluminium thing. And imports probably at 2 or 3% more. And then we're over the hill when it comes to risk for any kind of cannibalization of demand from the TSOs. So
in a way, the power rationing will be saved by industrial shutdowns.
Yes, and net imports, which finally comes after not coming before September.
Exactly. I don't know if there's any question. We maybe have time for one or two small questions.
Hello, Mirka Mäkelä from Helen. I would like to ask you about the upcoming price caps. Not how they affect the coming winter, but it has been done once, it can be done again. So will this increase the regulatory risk for power producers, and how will it affect the upcoming investments in the production?
That's a very good question. Of course, it will reduce renewable investments probably, because you cannot get the 100% profit which you probably needed to start up with new projects going into the future. So this is a very negative impact for renewables, was influenced by this price cap. And it also might have some negative impact on actual operations during the winter for thermal plants. It might reduce thermal generation. That's a risk when it comes to the physical world now. But when it comes to the wind and solar and even hydro investments, it's a very high risk for either shut down projects in renewables or delay it. And we already heard 2 or 3 hydropower projects in Norway which will reduce their investments, not due to the EU regulations, but due to taxation regulation in Norway, which is also coming up in the same way to take more of the super profits in hydropower. So yes, it's negative for wind power investments and even solar investments, any kind of capping of their profits.
Excellent. I think that's good. It's also a good crossover to our next presentation, which is about wind power supply in Finland. So thank you very much, Olav, for your presentation.
Thank you, Olav.
Thank you.
And then we will move on to our next session, which is about power supply, new power supply in Finland. We will start with Anni Mikkonen of the Finnish Wind Power Association. She will give us her view about the outlook and also the obstacles against more wind power production.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anni Mikkonen. I'm from the Finnish Wind Power Association, and I'm very delighted to be here this afternoon. It's nice to see you all on live. This is the topic of our discussion, so I thought that I'd give you some thoughts beforehand we start the discussion. Here you can see the wind power capacity that we had in the end of June this year. There was a significant increase already in the spring of the capacity. I think it was something like 26 or 27% increase. 11 turbines are offshore turbines, the rest are onshore. We also see that the production, wind power production, will increase a lot in the coming years. This curve is drawn on the basis of published investment decisions. So this is not our estimate, it is about the investment decisions that are already published and the projects are under construction right now. In 2021, 10% of Finnish electricity consumption was covered with wind power. And we know that at least 28% of the electricity consumption will be covered with wind by 2025. So there's a massive construction going on right now. My estimate, this is my personal estimate, the red dotted line, is that we see the curve going up in the coming years, like it's now going up in 22, 23, 24. So, the topic was the question that are we getting what the system needs now? So is the wind power what the electricity system needs? Well, of course, coming from the wind power industry, I have to say that absolutely, this is what we need right now. If we look at the energy dependency numbers of Finland and EU, we see that we are far from independence. Here you can see the value of energy imports in 2020. Most of it comes from oil and gas, petroleum products, also some coal and natural gas, and of course the imported electricity that you saw in the previous presentation we will soon get rid of. Well, wind power is the key driver also of the electrification of industry, heating and transportation sector. We have to get them carbon neutral. We also have to increase the energy independence of Finland due to the events that have been seen over the past 6 months, over the past year. Here you can see the estimate of Fingrid, how much the wind power capacity could be increased by 2030. All these graphs here depend on the level of electrification of different industries. We know that these are coming online for sure, and then the further we go, the more insecurity there is in the numbers. But as you see from the Fingrid graph, it is possible to increase the wind power capacity a lot in Finland. Well, is wind power then the only thing that is needed? Of course not. We need flexibility in production and in consumption. The electrification and then the power to X solutions are also needed. And I think that this coming winter is going to be sort of a big test for the demand response that we will then be able to also use in the future when there's going to be more and more wind power in the system. So that was all that I wanted to show you before we start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anni. And we will organize it so Lari Järvenpää, who is the head of system solution at Fortum, he will come now and he will give his small presentation, and then we will have a joint Q&A after his presentation. So he will now give Fortum's view on what will happen on new supplies.
Good. Hello everybody from my behalf as well, and thanks Anni a lot for the good introduction on the wind power potential. I actually thought that in a way I start by saying that we agree, but I guess that there is actually no but, because you said also that in a way wind power alone does not suffice. So that stole a bit my storyline, but let's nevertheless try to go through. The agreeing part first. Yeah, Fortum is undoubtedly a big believer in decarbonization and electrification, and that has always been the case. We do expect Nordic electricity demand, European electricity demand, even the global electricity demand to grow pretty darn fast in the next couple of years and decades to decarbonize and electrify the resulting or remaining fossil energy usage. And of course, in terms of the Nordics, wind power is undoubtedly the prime motor there driving that growth, and will certainly make a large part of the capacity additions, and consequently, of course, in a way we do also believe in that, and we are taking part of that growth also by building one of the largest wind power parks in Pjelaxpöle at the moment, going to be commissioned in 2024. But then, of course, wind does not always blow and sun does not always shine, and there is an inherent flexibility need. Anni already alluded to that fact in the system also today, and also increasingly going forward. Looking at our data, we do identify a lot of, let's say, high renewables weeks, where of course in a way then there is potentially even a bit too much of that supply, which potentially goes to waste if there is not enough of storages or demand flexibility in the system. But there are also these notorious dark doldrums, or the German saying was actually kalte Dunkelflaute, if somebody still wants to learn that language. And they're basically, even overbuilding renewables is not really maybe the solution to go to, but rather there is a need for incremental, dispatchable and firm and flexible capacity that then covers those needs today and also going forward. Together with, of course, imports, which undoubtedly are a solution, but as also Jukka alluded to, maybe something that we cannot completely trust every single moment in the future. And we actually run a test simulation in the Nordics with our European-wide power market simulation model, trying to see that what would happen actually in Nordic if we would strongly electrify the Nordic system, but we would only, in a one-to-one annual energy terms relation, back that electrification and that incremental electricity demand with onshore wind. The result is, in some sense, I guess, pretty intuitive. It points to a position where at some point actually the Nordic system either breaks down or there's a big need to rely on demand flexibility, assumptions of which are, to say the least, very uncertain. And at least I would not, as a societal policymaker, try to bet on that flexibility really being there. And of course, in a way, the reality is even worse than this, because this is actually on a so-called normal weather year, and then on let's say, on more adverse weather events or adverse weather years, the need for flexibility from demand side in the absence of any dispatchable supply would, of course, be even much more dramatic than here. However, balancing and capacity adequacy is not actually everything that the system needs. There are more esoteric engineering, power engineering-like needs as well, some of which, or one of which was actually mentioned by Jukka. That's called inertia. That is basically the system's ability to withstand small deviations in the frequency balance. And of course, overall in Europe, in the world, in the Nordics as well, there has been a decent amount of inertia in the system in the past due to the presence of a large rotating mass. But that situation is changing actually pretty fast, and this is an estimation from Svenska Kraftnät showing how much of there will be this so-called low inertia hours in the system going forward. And already in 2018 we actually started to see some problems around this issue with some decisions that the Swedish TSO needed to do for Oskarshamn plant to actually reduce that output in order to guarantee a sufficient amount of inertia in the system. Inertia is not everything. There's also reactive power that is important in the system, or put in other words, voltage control. Also problems around that issue were pretty prevalent and much discussed also in 2020 summer in Sweden, where actually the TSO again needed to, I would say, emergency procure a lot of, well, actually output from 3 different plants to then guarantee that a sufficient amount of short circuit power and reactive power is in the system, which is a bit of like a local phenomenon, but still very important for the system stability in selected parts of Sweden. And maybe finally, of course, in a way, we do already see at the moment that the availability and production of selected assets inside a selected point in the grid are actually increasingly important. Again, coming to the point that was mentioned earlier today already on this Fennoskan or Sweden 3 Finland line, which is unfortunately congested still and limited at the moment due to the fact that there is not enough of output on the Swedish side guaranteeing the grid stability on that side, and that's because of that's then resulting in the Swedish TSO to limit the transmission capacity from Finland to Sweden to guarantee the overall system stability. So clearly the solution is actually more wind, obviously, more grid, but actually more also firm supply that then covers all of these, let's say, system stability services. Which of course then points to a question that what is actually a system that we target and who is the one on the driver's seat? Is it the energy customers or is it actually the society itself? You see on this slide 3 different characterizations of a net zero carbon global electricity system from one external vendor, pointing to the fact that actually there is no one single pathway along which the net zero carbon electricity system can be reached, but there are actually multiple different alternatives. The right-hand side, or the one in the middle, which is called green, is of course excessively and very heavily relying on intermittent renewables capacity, and of course that then comes with the fact that there needs to be a lot of batteries and also quite a decent amount of hydrogen burn, which most likely will be pretty damn expensive also going forward. But then other possibly more balanced alternatives could, for instance, entail more reliance on nuclear capacity, because of course that is dispatchable, that is baseload, and then consequently there is less need for intermittency balancing capacity from, for instance, hydrogen burn. And ultimately, of course, the energy customers need to actually decide, and possibly the society needs to also decide, that what is the targeted state that we want to go to. Is it this kind of like a volatile green world, or is there actually room to, let's say, stabilize the output and stabilize the energy system with a bit more baseload type of a characteristics? That, of course, would be then prevalent in the red and gray alternative. Fortum is calling for a rethink in the energy market design, which today is, I would say, very short-term focused, and of course with that itself works pretty nicely. It allocates resources that are scarce in a very efficient way. But what it lacks is a top-down holistic planning and long-term investment signals, especially on the dispatchability and flexibility categories, which really clearly are, I would say, as important cornerstones of a future decarbonized energy system as the bulk additions of the variable intermittent electricity are. And we do actually think that security of supply and system stability, at least to a certain extent, are semi-public goods, which motivates the need that there is a need for a planning authority that then is in charge of, first of all, identifying the future needs of an energy system and then tendering those needs out in terms of the long-term contracts in order to then procure them in an efficient and cost-minimizing manner. Maybe to sum up, as has been said many times, Europe, of course, now finds itself in the midst of a crisis of a century, and this is actually undoubtedly a global energy crisis that we are living in at the moment. The reason is simple: we are having too little supply, too much of demand, and the only way out in the short term is to just reduce demand. There is no other way out. All these tips and tricks around price caps and separating gas price from power price are just, well, populistic stunts, I would say, but they don't really underlying and they don't really address the root cause, which is that there is too much of demand still out there, which needs to be addressed. But of course, then in the mid to long term, supply needs to be added, and we really need to invest ourselves out from the current mess that we are in. It is naive to think that investing only in variable intermittent renewables would solve all the systemic problems and issues that we are having already at the moment, maybe especially in Sweden at the moment in the Nordic system, but also perhaps in other places. We do need firmness, flexibility, dispatchability, these a bit esoteric and exotic system services and ancillary services across different products. And maybe in some sense, maybe finally now we need to get rid of the attitude that we are somehow like confronting the old world, you know, nuclear, hydro, possibly some other sources, with the new world, which is renewables. All sources will be needed as long as they are secure and clean. The exercise is too big to be carried out in a reliant way if we don't really get all the good sources and good ingredients into place. And that's why we now want to also change the market design to facilitate and encourage that going forward. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe if we just go to the...
Yeah, sure.
So then we can just start a discussion. Yes, it's of course, as prices tell us, it's too much demand and too little supply at the moment. And Anni, of course, you mentioned wind. It's been growing incredibly over the last few years in Finland. I think you said 28% now you expect in 2025 of consumption. Yes. Which is a huge share historically, but still far below a country like Denmark, where more than 50%. So I guess there is a potential to grow, to increase it even more. What are the main obstacles to do that at the moment?
Well, one of the challenges is, of course, the slow planning and spatial planning and permitting of the projects, especially the long handling times of courts is the thing that hinders the development at the moment. We see that from the projects that are under development, some 50% of the capacity is in really, really early phase, meaning that it takes from 4 to 6 years to get the spatial plan, to get all the permits, and then it might take even 4 years before those are legally valid. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges. The second one is the question of how to be able to also construct wind power in the eastern part of Finland. 40% of the capacity is in the northern Österbotten, and 46% of the projects of the project pipeline is in the same area. We would need more production in the southeast of Finland to balance the production that we have now.
Has that been linked to some defense objections? And is that becoming even easier, more difficult now with the tensions that you see in the world?
Yeah, well, we have the 1,300 kilometers of border with Russia, and of course it is important that we continue to have the border there. But we see that you would need to have some technical solutions to be, to better to make it easier to the coexistence between the military and wind power.
Because you want to spread the farms out around the country, so it's easier to supply people and not locate everything in one area.
Well, yeah, of course that, but also the production. And then the third thing is that we would also need offshore wind power in Finland. There's a huge interest towards offshore, but the development is really slow, and it is still the question if it's feasible or not.
You can come back to that. Lari, Fortum was for many years quite reluctant to go into wind, but then you started to invest in onshore wind. What do you need to invest in onshore wind now? What kind of conditions that do you need to see to invest more?
Well, I head the market analysis team, and maybe I'm the first one to say that it is pretty damn hard to forecast what is going to happen in the future. And maybe with that, in a way, not trying to be too binary, but in a way, it very well can be that taking a full market exposure alone without any PPAs, I don't know, possibly even some state backing, is not so much a way to go forward. And of course, in a way, when one then forms the PPA, one really also gets much more close relationships with the future customers and the future electrification of industries and big players. And of course, that's something that in a way we definitely want to be more active in going forward.
Yeah, and of course we come back to PPA in a presentation later today. But is it more difficult now with the problems that you have, the uncertainty in the market, the costs of everything from collateral to getting a loan? What is that complicating things, making it more difficult to get financing for new projects?
Well, probably it is. Everybody, including us, of course, sees that in a way the spectrum of different kind of outcomes and the spectrum of different kind of risks, from market risks to regulatory risks to policy risks, are maybe bigger than ever. So of course, depends on the risk tolerance, and I don't know if there's one single attitude that covers everybody. But in a way, when things are extremely volatile, of course, then, at least in theory, in a way, also the return requirements are higher than in more stable environments.
Have you seen that, Anni? Your members, are they concerned about the economic outlook and the possibility to actually get financing for new projects?
Well, at least until now, the investors have been really, really interested in the Finnish market. Finnish wind power has been seen as a good way to invest. But of course, with the current EU legislation, the discussions with that, it's difficult to say what will happen. Of course, we will see quite soon what kind of decisions the Finnish government will take.
What's your stand then on this? To mention the price seal, the income cap that have been that will be discussed tomorrow, I guess, in the among European energy ministers. How does your industry react to these kind of signals?
Of course, we see it as a risk to investment stability. But having said that, I also understand why EU wants to find solutions to cut down the electricity prices. It really depends on how the system is done. For example, if we think about wind power, if we think about a company that sells the electricity out through PPA, for example, baseload PPA, it really depends of the time span of what you are looking at. If it's looked hour after hour, then that's going to kill projects. That's going to kill some of the companies. But for example, if you look at your average price over a month or 3 months period, then that's okay. If you can take into the balance sheet your PPA income and the income that you get from the spot market. But it really depends how the system is done.
Do you, Lari, share, do you have any views on the same? You mentioned briefly the market design issues.
Yeah, I guess it really is so that the devil is in the details, and I guess we don't really know all the details yet. But of course, there are, you know, better outcomes and worse outcomes in terms of how then the regulation plays out.
Then finally, just to mention also the alternatives. You mentioned you can't live on wind only. You also need some base load, some generation capacity that is available when it's not blowing. What is the best alternatives now? Nuclear, Olav mentioned one nuclear plant that has been already cancelled due to the war. So now you have Olkiluoto up, but no new project in the pipeline. Do you expect more investments in large-scale nuclear in Finland or small-scale?
Well, at least I would not outrule such investments going forward. It's really then a game on the well, first of all, of course, the nuclear acceptability, but anyway, that clearly has risen. Well, it has been decently high in Finland all the time, but that clearly globally has risen, maybe to even unprecedented levels, one could say. But then, of course, in terms of the overall investment case, these are big projects, these are long lead times, there's a lot of risks coming back to the market risks, but also different other types of risk classes, and it very well might be so that in a way financing those investment cases, you know, large-scale nuclear or even small modular reactors would then need some type of an off-take agreement or something else.
In the very short term, you said you just announced that the Meri-Pori will come back to the market if you find enough coal and manpower to run it through the winter. Could we see more coal, peat coming back to the market short term, maybe increasing emissions even temporarily just to meet demand?
Well, sure, in the short term, of course, that can be, in a way, the solution, and that probably needs to be the solution in order to really guarantee security of supply. But of course, that's no strategy of ours. That's probably nobody's strategy. It is just a, let's say, a survival mode, so to say.
Okay, I think we are running a little bit behind schedule. So, but I thank you very much for participating, and we will be back after the break.
Very good. So now it's a coffee break, and coffees are served out in the area where you arrived. So be back here according to plan at 3 o'clock. We have an extensive program also later this afternoon.
Yes, we are, as everyone have seen, we are in a gas crisis. So the question is how deep it will be and for how long it will last. And to help us understand that, we're happy to have Trevor Sikorski from Energy Aspects, who has been following these markets for many, many years. And he will give us his latest update on the market situation and also some, both for Europe and also for the wider gas market. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you to Montel. Always great to be back in Helsinki, one of my favorite kind of European cities to come and visit people in. So yeah, what we're going to do is dig a bit deeper into the gas crisis, how we get through this winter, and indeed how long this might last. Now, as you can see, we've kind of started with the big reveal of what we think, and you can see from our price forecasts. And this picture, of course, was done actually at the end of last week, and of course quite a lot of things have happened since the end of last week. But basically we were bullish against the curve, but bullish for quite a long time. So we think this gas crisis is going to last throughout 23, throughout 24, and potentially even throughout 25. Now, and this is, of course, there's lots of uncertainty around, and lots of things that could potentially change what's going to happen. Now, if we look at the storage carryout, and we have different balances, but certainly one's just Northwest Europe and one's aggregate European. storage carryouts, you can see that the storage carryouts actually look okay. So you're looking at a common metric, of course, is the October carryout. And this October, we're looking to carry out probably about 92, 93 BCM. That's over about 90% full. So a reasonably comfortable carryout. So you'd look at these storage numbers, and even if you look at 23, again, what looks a reasonably comfortable level. But of course, what's that obscuring is how we got that reasonable, comfortable level given everything that's happened. And the main thing, of course, that's happened is this massive change to Russian gas supply into the European market. And we think, certainly for 2022, we're going to have something like 106 BCM taken out of the European market. That's an enormous amount of gas, and that's coming out of the global gas market because there's nowhere else for that Russian gas to go. And by the end of 2023, we think there'll be another 153 BCM, or in total there'll be 153 BCM. So in 2023, the incremental drop in supply just from Russia will be probably around 45 BCM. And that's because this amount of supply that we had here will disappear, and all we're going to be left with now, we think, is Turk Stream gas. Now, of course, one of the things that happened this week was the announcement that there's certainly more disagreements between Naftagaz and Gazprom coming out and saying there'll be, we're likely to sanction Naftagaz, which means they won't even use the one line that's giving us a little bit of additional gas, and that we probably expected to last until at least the end of the year. So you're looking at this, and you're looking at this very low level compared to this very high level here, and that has just fundamentally changed everything, right? And so, we look at this and we say, well, if you look at this and you get a Ukrainian flow halt, and you don't have any price response, then we would expect a kind of March carryout, or an end of October carryout next year to be somewhere in the range of about 60 to 65 BCM. So it's only 60 to 65 BCM full, 65% full. And that, of course, is very, very concerning. But what it says is, well, we're going to have to see a lot of very, very high prices in order to get this back to the type of levels that the European market will be happy with, and European policymakers will be happy with. And of course, one of the things that we saw as an immediate response was European policymakers coming in and say, well, we have to legislate minimum storage requirements. And those minimum storage requirements this year are 80%, but they're supposed to go up to 90% next year. And if they go up to 90% next year, that means over the summer, you are going to have to inject an awful lot of gas, because you're going to be doing that without any of this Russian gas that we actually got. And that was Russian gas coming through Nord Stream, Russian gas that was coming through the Ukraine. And of course, Nord Stream started to come out of the market and rapidly kind of came out of the market, but we still had more than half a year with some of those flows. So this is very, very concerning in terms of this looks an unsustainable amount, and to get it back up to a sustainable amount will need, and we've heard a lot about this already today, but what that will need is a lot of demand-side response, or demand destruction. Now, the reason we have such good storage, even with this massive, this massive drop in Russian supply, is because there has been demand-side reduction. And that demand-side reduction has come globally. So prices, the height of prices we've seen in those really big and volatile prices that we saw are all about getting that demand-side response. And that demand-side response comes from the global market, where we're seeing, South Asia losing a lot of gas demand, freeing up LNG. We see the Chinese having had a very, very weak year and lost a lot of LNG and happy to sell LNG back into the market. And of course, we've seen European demand reductions as well. So these prices, these high global prices, are there because we've lost so much supply into the market, and they're signaling demand-side response. Now, like I've signaled, the one thing that it's done, and it's been very successful, is to bring a lot more LNG into the market, right? So a lot more LNG coming into the market, into the European market. And you can see this big change in dynamics in terms of incremental LNG take. So what we saw, historically, as Asia was growing in a growing market, particularly the Chinese market, a bit the Indian market, they would just grow, they would take more LNG. If there wasn't enough additional LNG supply into the market, then Europe would lose it, and we were happy with that. We didn't need it because we had so much pipeline supply, so much flexible supply. And this has been one of the biggest changes in the global gas market this year, is that we've gone from Europe not ever having to compete and not even worrying when we did use LNG supply, to now always being on the bid. We are always bidding for LNG, and this is not going to change because those Russian supply reductions are never coming back. Those long-term contracts are all worth nothing. Neither side respects them, and neither side is honoring them. So they're worth nothing, and they aren't coming back. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is what we saw this year. So we've seen this really big increase in LNG, which has come in part because we've had a year-on-year increase in global LNG supply, which was reasonably healthy, probably about 20 BCM, helped in part by things like Hammerfest, the Norwegian plant coming back online, which counts as an increment because it was off for all of 2021. So that was regional supply, some additional US supply coming onto the market through things like Calcasieu Pass, a number of the big facilities, but also because we saw these, these big Asian demand reductions freeing up LNG into the market. Now, one of the things that we think is probably likely to happen is we were getting a little bit lucky in some of that, in the sense that Chinese demand was incredibly weak. And Chinese demand's around 10 million tons, around something like 14, 15 BCM of what came into the market from LNG was because China was so soft. And China was so soft because of a number of things. One was a very mild Chinese winter. They'd gone in very heavily contracted with a lot of stocks. As it got soft, they went in and started selling gas into the market. And of course, that gas came into the European bases. Now, the other things we saw was, of course, then we got into the parts of the year where we had the big COVID lockdowns around Shanghai. Shanghai, a massively important industrial hub for the Chinese, and that kept industrial production really low. And then we've seen this kind of rolling, this kind of series of rolling localized COVID restrictions throughout China, continuing through the rest of this year. But we've also seen something which was quite different, and it was a very different approach to Chinese stimulus. So Chinese stimulus often in very, very heavy industry, and this time around, that stimulus was a lot less successful in doing that because the stimulus wasn't going into end buying big infrastructure, it went into wages. And this was a new approach that the Chinese were taking a bit to stimulus, and it didn't transfer so much into industrial production. So we've had a year of very low industrial production numbers from the Chinese, allowing them to sell additional LNG into the market. And there's a big risk that this begins to change. And the main thing that, of course, changes it is you are having a very, very big party congress. That party congress at the moment has taken up a lot of political time and activity from the current leadership. And if they go back into a place where they start really, after the Congress, to really prioritize industrial growth, what you're going to probably see is a lot of pressure on the Chinese importers, the national oil and gas companies like PetroChina and Sinopec, not to resell gas into the market, but to ensure that there's enough gas to push forward Chinese industrial production growth and by extension, economic growth. So if you get that, what you could start to see is the return of Asian demand into this market. Now, our assumptions on Asian demand fall short of saying they're going to go back into the spot market. And in fact, all we're saying really with that Asian demand is they retreat back to taking their termed contracts. And this is quite important because this is just saying we get the Asians only doing what their term contracts are suggesting. So they're not selling back into the market. So the TTF, which has been the magnet for LNG to come into because it's been so high, starts to falter because the Asians have enough underlying demand and rely on keeping their term contracts. And the term contracts tend not to be priced on any kind of spot index, unless it's probably Henry Hub, or on a Brent index. And all of those mean a lot lower priced gas. So it's a lot more affordable, particularly for the Asian developers. And if you get just this amount happening, what that means is the additional incremental supply from LNG into the European market is not going to be particularly high. So we think over 2023, probably about 16 million tons of additional LNG supply will be in the market, but we think about 10 or 11 million tons of that will go into the Asian market, meaning there's only 4 or 5 million tons to come into the European market. So that means we'll incrementally have lost about 45 BCM of Russian gas, but we'll only be able to replace that with maybe 6 or 7 BCM of gas from the LNG market. And that's despite adding a lot of regasification capacity quickly into the European market. And this is quite interesting because there's a very big difference about adding, in terms of the time it takes, to add LNG regasification than it does LNG liquefaction. And liquefaction is the supply part of that. And we don't have our slide on here. But if you look at liquefaction, there's been a lot of kind of contract signed, FID signed, but it takes so long to get that stuff built. It takes 4 or 5 years. And what this means is we don't actually see a big supply wave coming into the market from the LNG until about 2026. And that means we have a whole bunch of years where you're getting very small increments, and the Europeans are still going to have to try and bid and compete with the Asians for those small increments. And that's despite having probably by the beginning of 2023, almost somewhere between 15 and 20 million tons of additional regas capacity. So we're having loads of regas capacity come in, but there's probably only a little bit of incremental supply to come into that regas. So what is all of this regas going to do to the European? Is it going to have no impact? Well, it's not going to have a massive impact on underlying TTF levels, but it's going to have a big impact on what's called the DES to TTF spread. Now, the DES spread is basically the price of LNG on the water in Northwest Europe against the TTF. And so usually that, historically, it's been really thin because all you really had to do was kind of pay, a bit of regas charge, and then you're at the hub. So maybe it was at a little bit of a discount. Once in a while, it would go to a bit of a premium. But generally, often at a very little discount. Now, we've seen these massively blow out. And the reason they've massively blown out is the TTF's actually been so successful in attracting LNG from Asia this year that it's actually become very congested, our regasification capacity. So you have a whole bunch of ships sitting around waiting to unload LNG, but we just don't have enough regas. And all of the spare regas was sitting in the more tangential markets like the UK and Spain. So you were getting really big NBP to TTF spreads, you were getting big Spanish to TTF spreads, you were getting these really big spreads, and that should come out of the market, because you're all of a sudden putting all of this new regas into markets like the Netherlands and Germany, which are very, very closely connected to the TTF. So these spreads should be the thing that comes out the most. So these really deep spreads, and we've had like policymakers go, oh my God, look at these massive spreads. We should be able to get gas at this price. Well, no, because this is just pricing against the TTF, and all that discount is doing is reflecting the congestion in getting the gas into the European market. And what this will do is it will take away that congestion. So yes, a lot of gas is probably going to be rerouted, and what will happen is these will come very, very close to each other, but it's not going to have the effect of really balancing a market in a world where we're losing more gas than we're getting to have it put back in. So how does the market balance? And of course the market balances, as we've heard a lot of, through demand reductions or demand destructions. And there's a lot of difficulty in how you kind of model this, and certainly, you know, when we look at modeling and we've put in prices into our models, you know, we don't have that much price. We basically got one winter of prices to kind of base that on. So in terms of our regression analysis, they are linear, and they do predict reasonable amounts of what we'd say is demand reduction. So this is the amount we expect to have compared to, you know, what it was over the, you know, historically, and what it would be given lower TTF prices. And we expect to see it as well, probably in the residentials. But the big kind of, I'd say, there's a number of issues with understanding how long and how deep this is going to be. Now, some of the things is because we do, and we have seen a lot of subsidization, right? It is very difficult for policymakers to sit there and say, yes, we're happy to have massive reductions in residential and commercial demand, because in the winter, certainly that means people are freezing, and you have all kinds of social problems with that. Likewise, when you start to see very, very big reductions in industrial demand, then of course you're looking at this risk of, do we have deindustrialization in Europe? Do we just lose, you know, do we lose productive capacity that we will never get back? And that's the biggest risk here. And when you look at a sustained period of very, very high gas prices in Europe, and that, and a regionalization of gas prices, which means other parts of the world aren't seeing that, particularly North America, which is quite isolated from this, and the Middle East, where you have a lot of gas, surplus gas. These are areas where that industry could go and not come back. So the biggest questions, you know, for, you know, on an analytical basis is, well, how permanent is this? You know, and how quickly might it come back? Because just saying gas demand is down is fine, but it masks, like, why is it down? Is it down because activity is down, or is it down because of fuel switching? Now, we don't have, you know, brilliant data, but we have some data, and the French are very good, actually, in breaking out the data by sector. And this is quite interesting, because this is what happened last winter, and certainly we started already having very high gas prices last winter, but you can see there's one sector dominating the reduction in gas demand. And that one sector is refining. Now, if you compare what happened in refining, the gas demand, with what was happening with refining's actual production levels, refining levels were actually really, really good. We had an increase in rates. It was year on year, one of the strongest sectors in Europe. So what was happening here was you just had fuel switching. You had gas being pushed out and liquids being used. And of course, the refining sector is awash in liquids. So a lot of LPG just being used to replace the more gaseous fuels. So you would say, well, this is very temporary, right? It's just based on relative prices. As soon as relative prices switch, that could come back. Now, that's true probably of refining, but it's less true when you look at some of the other sectors. And indeed, you know, if any of you have been following industrial production numbers, you know, what you'd see is the beginning of the year, we were still really, really strong in industrial production growth year on year. Now we're incredibly weak, and, you know, you are starting to see these reductions in activity. And the real problem is when you start to see some of these sectors, which look, you know, temporary, start to become permanent. And this is probably the biggest downside risk to gas, you know, to gas prices, because what you're basically saying was, if they're temporary, well, you still have to keep the prices really high, because you need to continuously encourage that fuel switching, right? As it becomes permanent, well, it's a permanent loss, right? And your prices have already kind of achieved that, right? And what it would be saying is, as we took prices back down, you wouldn't get the demand response to see it come, that demand come back into the market. And that's the one thing that could start taking prices down from where they are, from up very high from where they are, to start taking them down low. And, what we'd say is certainly, this is true of all of the demand side response you're seeing both here and in Asia, because that's what we're relying on, is both of those demand responses to stay the same, right? And if you do get demand going back, let's say in Asia, then it starts taking LNG away from us, and again, our prices have to go up in that kind of very vicious circle. Now, it'll probably be a while before we figure out and before we see, exactly how much of this is permanent and how much of this is just fuel switching. But certainly we are heading into a place where the longer this happens, probably the more permanent this becomes, or the risk of more permanent deindustrialization becomes. Because it is when people start to say, you would start to say, well, people, are hedged. They were hedged at low prices. But we're getting to the point where you've almost had a year of high prices. So hedges are rolling off. They're coming to an end. And people, industry is being more and more exposed to those high prices. And even when you look at the demand side in the ResCom, lots of government support, but that government support has tended to come at relatively high price levels as well. So you have a number of things here, all happening, which is saying, well, a lot of money just going into fossils, a lot of money going to subsidize fossils, right? All of this kind of happening and taking away a lot of purchasing power. That's going to weigh heavily on industry, and an industry which is already having to spend a lot more on just buying fossils, right, and buying gas in particular. So this is probably the big downside risk to, I would say, energy prices, but it's a problematic risk for all of Europe, and probably the biggest single policy challenge we have in dealing with, the cost of living crisis is the length of how long this could go on. And until you get that permanent kind of reduction in demand, it's always just fighting and having to subsidize and being very, very difficult to manage. So this is certainly this is just a quick slide on power. Lots already being said on power. All I would say is power has made things a bit worse this year, right? Because we were relying on gas demand to get some kind of response in the power side, and we haven't had that. We haven't had that because France has had an awful year with nuclear. It's been very dry everywhere, so we haven't had very much hydro. And so, even though we have seen a fair amount of gas, gas going on the margin, gas being priced out, we've still had to burn an awful lot of gas in power. And if we could change some of these problems around power, it would help out. And it would help out quite considerably because it would allow the call on thermal generally to shrink. And of course, gas is the thing most on the margin and would be the thing that would shrink first. So on that basis, I think that was my last slide. Certainly, we've talked a lot about stuff. We'll turn it over to you guys to see if you've got any questions at all.
Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you.
Yes, maybe we could just ask a question about the what happened this week in the Baltic Sea with the explosions there of the Nord Stream pipelines. The market reaction afterwards, is that in a way how you expected it, or is it too low, too high? What will be the impact in your mind?
Well, it was in a world where so many crazy things has happened, that was probably the craziest, and that quite says something. But it was a kind of market reaction where it was like, what on earth is that all about? Because it wasn't very clear, exactly who was responsible, but everyone thinks it's the Russians, and it probably was. But why would they do that? Because those pipelines had already shut off. They weren't actively flowing any gas. And there wasn't anyone's expectation, I think, in the market, certainly wasn't ours, but I think, anyone we talked to, no one thought Nord Stream was going to come back. This year, next year, probably the year after, right? you know, that we're not close to a resolution in this conflict. You will need regime change before we even start to begin to normalize our relationships with the Russians. All of the term contracts, you know, have so many issues with them that you could never get a restart of most of them, right? Because you'll have all of the Europeans turning around and saying, we've lost millions because you guys haven't been sending the gas we started nominating, and the Russians would turn out and said, well, you guys said you were going to stop using Russian gas in 2027, so what's that all about? You didn't have any sanctity for those contracts anyways. So it didn't change anything in people's expectations, so why did it happen? Why would the Russians do this? Well, one, it was kind of maybe saying, you know, potentially saying, look, no one's going to get access, you're never going to get access to our gas again, and you know, it's going to take ages and ages, right, for that to happen. The other thing was the Baltic pipe, which is a pipeline between the Norwegian continental shelf and Poland, was supposed to was going to have its commissioning ceremony, I think, next week, right? So the timing was a bit of probably saying, look, if we can do this to our own infrastructure, we can do this to your infrastructure, right? So really sending out this message and probably trying to put risk premium back into the market, because the Russians have got to a place, and you know, if we looked, you know, if we go back to, you know, our beginning, you would say, well, this can't be very good for Gazprom's revenues. And the answer was, well, actually, this was fantastic for Gazprom's revenues. They were profit maximizing as a monopolist would, because the increase in prices associated with this was so much higher than the reduction in volumes. But now we've got to a place where they don't have very much volume at all, and they are starting to get into diseconomies. So that revenue is starting to come down. And of course, we'd lost about 100 euros as we started to get to that point where storage was looking a lot better for this winter and you know, in coming down. And so maybe they were just looking to get risk premium back into the market, but it didn't really happen because everyone's like, well, yeah, we weren't expecting Russian gas anyway. So it didn't have you know, that big an impact on the markets per se, but I think it increased kind of the political concern over what the Russians are actually capable of doing and how desperate the Russians actually are. So certainly it introduces some risk, but not a really tangible one that probably people in the market really understand.
And then maybe, I don't know if there's any questions. We could maybe ask you a bit about the LNG. Of course, you mentioned China after the COVID shutdowns ease. Sometimes the demand there will come back, and that will make it more difficult to attract the LNG to Europe. For how many years will it take for this LNG supply to be low? I mean, until you will get enough LNG to bring prices down considerably?
Yeah, I mean, so what we're looking at is we are looking, because we had like a very big wave of LNG into the market around 2019, 2020, which was the end of the big wave of the first wave of US LNG into the market. So people hadn't taken a lot of FIDs, they hadn't started to build new things for a while, and you had a lot of projects that have been in development and just couldn't find enough long-term takers. And of course what happened in the first half of this year was you got a lot of people signing up for these contracts, and a lot of these projects which were quite long in gestation, kind of saying, yeah, okay, we're going to go ahead now, we've got enough security, or we're willing to take enough risk on this. But what that means is most of these, you know, nothing really happened in 2020, so most of these are now just starting construction. But these are big, long, complex projects, and you will see first gas, you know, at the earliest in 25, but more like 26, 27. So it does look like you know, without, you know, with just taking 150 BCM out of the market really, really rapidly, it has caused this big hole in the global gas market that is going to take a number of years, you know, before we even start to fill it and to fix it. And so that is problematic, and that does mean that for this period, you know, we would expect, let's say, the TTF to be at a consistent premium to the Asian markets, because we're consistently having to bid away gas from the Asian markets. And, you know, it becomes this question of, well, what's the price of demand destruction in Asia, and what's the price of demand destruction in Europe? And you probably need, like you have this year, to continue to get both of those. So both of those things providing a degree of support into pricing, because we're having to wait for quite a long time before we get enough supply to really backfill everything we've lost this year.
Excellent. I think that sums it up fine, and then we will just move on with the program. Thank you, Trevor, for your presentation.
Well, thank
you, Trevor.
Cheers. Thanks.
And then we will move to the local implications for the Finnish and Baltic market with Gasum, the largest gas company here in Finland. Jouni Liimatta is their head of trading, and he will give us his view on how this gas crisis is impacting Finland and the Baltic-Finnish gas market.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, my name is Jouni Liimatta. I'm representing Gasum, and I would like to thank Montel to invite me here again. I think last time I was presenting at the Finnish Energy Day was a couple of years ago, but happy to be back. Before I go into my presentation, I would like to ask the audience few questions. If you could just raise your hand. So in the current environment, how many of you are following gas prices? Okay, yes, almost everyone. So I would say 90% of the audience. How many of you think that the gas prices have an impact to power market? Okay. All right. Then maybe the most difficult question. How many of you are currently using gas in your power production? Okay, 4. I would say 4%, so quite a big, and this actually shows the thing at the moment in the market. So gas prices are, let's say, very interesting at the moment. Pipelines blowing up here and there, and everyone's following the gas prices, the development on a daily basis. Of course, European gas prices are following TTF prices. TTF is the main index price for European gas. Since the war began, we've seen a huge price increases, obviously. So from February, beginning of March, we traded here at 345 euros per megawatt hour, then slowed down, and then the Russians, as Trevor just mentioned, the Russians stopped the supplies or cut the supplies a little bit, optimizing maybe, I don't know. But then ever since, more and more pipelines from Russia has been closed down and prices have been moving up. Obviously, when earlier this week, the latest crazy event that happened on the gas market was the blowout of both Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. The price impact was very muted. So prices were trading around 180 and then moved up to 220, but that's nothing. So, but if you remember, let's say a few years back, the prices were constant at between maybe 15 and 30 or 15 and 25. Now we are seeing almost on a daily basis volatile moves of 20 euros or even more. And gas prices certainly have a huge impact to the power market. Here's a picture of the forward prices, how the financial market is currently pricing the future development. I have here 6 months ago the financial market thought that, so it was March 29th this year. The forward price looked like yeah, we would be back close to 50 euros per megawatt hour by this summer of 23. That obviously didn't happen. Why I'm showing this chart is just that although financial market and financial whiz kids think that they know everything and can predict the market, that's complete nonsense. It's not how the market works. So no one actually has the knowledge of the future development, the gas prices. But currently, the orange line is the one that is currently priced. So next year, and we will still be around 200 euros per megawatt hour price levels, which is extremely high. And that leads to a big problem. The gas demand in Finland and Baltics in 21, total of close to 65, 67 terawatt hours per year. Supplies were coming from Russia, but also then from Klaipėda, and then the storage in Jukka in Latvia. But due to the price impact, this situation has changed severely. So no more Russian supplies. It's Klaipėda, Inchukans that we are leaning on. And then during the next winter, obviously this Baltic connector pipeline is going to be a huge bottleneck if there's going to be a cold winter. So in Finland, of course, people have been really worried, especially on the industrial side, but also on the heat and power production, that how are we able to sustain the deliveries throughout the winter months. The demand of gas, here's a picture of the gas demand during the last 3 years on the gray bars. So it's each of the months. Gray bar is year 2020, the yellow is 21, and the green is this year. And this kind of illustrates the situation. Demand is dropping in Finland and in Baltics faster than maybe in the rest of the Europe. The markets are of course different, but the price situation is the biggest driver. So going forward in 2022, we are expecting now the Finnish gas demand to drop by whopping 52%. So last year in 21 we had a demand or gas consumption of about 25 terawatt hours in Finland. Now we're expecting something like 12 terawatt hours, and that even might be optimistic. In Estonia we are expecting something like, or forecasting 3.8 terawatt hours, down by 25%, Latvia down by 33%, and then Lithuania down by 40%. Of course, when people were looking at the situation where Russian supply was cut off, our governments in Finland and also in Estonia decided to go for an FSRU project together, securing the supplies for coming winters and helping us to survive without the Russian deliveries. Also, Polish pipeline coming from Polish side to Lithuania, so-called Kibel pipeline, that also opened up this year, 1st of May, which helps the market to be supplied. There's still some bottlenecks with Baltic connector and then Kiemenai between the border of Lithuania and Latvia. The FSRU, few comments about that. Now the scheduled start of the operation is mid-December. It should have, has a nameplate capacity of 30 to 45 terawatt-hours. Remember that the whole market in 21 was about 65 terawatt-hours. So this one vessel has the capacity to supply most of the demand in this region. Current information is that the capacity auction that they have been planning is 2 slots per month, meaning that the planned capacity is 24 terawatt-hours per year, which is still, I would say, quite sufficient to fill the demand in the local region. Pricing is still unknown, which is quite amazing that this FSRU vessel should start the operations sometime mid-December or in January. We still don't know what is the price of the usage of that vessel. As Trevor also mentioned in his presentation, I was actually wondering, is there anything left for me to say, because he mentioned everything, but yes, quite a lot of FSRUs and LNG receiving terminal capacity increases have been announced, especially in Germany. 4 new FSRUs, but also in Netherlands. One of them, Eemshaven, has already started the operations. These 2 of these German ones will start operation in Q1 next year, and also the Finnish one, I would say mid-December to early January. But all these new projects, I can understand it from, let's say, political perspective, that it's the politicians said that, okay, we built your library, please bring the books. And in this case, it's difficult. As we heard from Trevor, there's not going to be new LNG production facilities coming up until 25, 26. So where on earth is the LNG coming to these new FSRUs? That is the big problem. So at the moment it's still unknown, and it actually means, just as Trevor also mentioned, that the prices need to stay at high levels. If we look at the LNG supply to Northwest Europe and Italy, mainly from Qatar, USA, Russia, okay, that's possibly gone, Algeria, and rest of the world. If we look at the world as a whole, Japan and China, the Asian market, of course, those are the big players that Europe needs to battle against. So it's the Australian cargoes, maybe not, but Qatar cargoes could arrive here, also from US, but still, if we are looking at the largest importers, it's China and Japan. And Europe needs to lure in the LNG cargoes going forward as well from these places. And as said, the LNG map as such, here we can see quite a lot of production, Southeast Asia, Qatar has new projects coming up, as said, in 25, 26. Also US producers, new projects coming on stream in larger scale than in 2025, 2026 and onwards. So it means that for the next couple of years, it's unfortunately looks like we are going to have lots of, let's say, high-priced LNG arriving. LNG imports, as Trevor also mentioned, we didn't coordinate the slides. But yes, so we've seen a record amount of LNG deliveries coming to Europe. So almost on a month, every single month, we've seen a record amount of LNG cargoes coming, and that has helped to balance the situation. So lots of new 25 BCM, meaning 257 terawatt hours of LNG imports increase that we've seen now during this year. As a summary, demand is lower because of the high prices. Is that demand coming back? It's very difficult to see. As said, we are seeing quite a lot of demand destruction in that sense that although LNG and natural gas is more environmentally friendly than coal or oil products, due to the pricing, companies are using these more pollutive sources of energy. So refining companies, they are using propane instead of gas. And those who can, they will switch to something else than gas because of the prices. And our forecast is that, similar to Trevor, we are forecasting that the gas prices will need to stay at higher levels, unfortunately. Of course, the big unknown is the global recession. So global recession due to the inflation increasing, higher interest rates, and production shutdowns due to those reasons, it will lead to, unfortunately, unemployment, lower industrial demand. So we are pricing in a global recession. So it can balance the market a little bit and balance the prices as well, but still, it's not a good thing that we need to have a global recession to lower and balance the market. The Finnish and Baltic gas markets, as shown from the maps, is going to be heavily dependent on LNG supplies. And there will be heavy competition as well from, let's say, against the German, Netherlands, Italian, all these new FSRU projects. And it's not only Europe, but it's also rest of the world that is looking after these LNG supplies. So we are going to be in a situation where unfortunately gas prices are forecasted to stay at high levels, and also in this part of the world. That was my last slide.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation. We could ask you about the LNG terminal that comes into Finland maybe around Christmas. What is the capacity to bring that gas into the gas pipeline network? Is there a potential bottleneck there that if you can't get enough quick enough if it's very cold, for example?
Yes. So the FSRU, how it's now planned is that it would have a regasification volume of 60 to 140 or 120 gigawatt hours per day. And it means that in the current demand picture, I would say today, Finnish consumption of gas is around 20 to maybe 30, let's say 30 gigawatt hours per day. So Finnish demand on the gas is 30 gigawatt hours per day. This vessel, the planned capacity is 60 to 140 gigawatt hours. So it means that if the demand is at 30, there's quite a bit of excess gas and it needs to flow somewhere. In the pipeline network it goes south via Baltic connector and then finds a new home in Estonia or Latvia or then in Lithuania. But very likely what it means is that as the Baltic connector pipeline, currently it has a capacity of about 65 gigawatt hours per day. So 65 is the number. If the Finnish demand again is the 30 gigawatt hours per day, and someone would come there with a big vessel and tries to regasify at let's say 100 gigawatt hours or even 120 gigawatt hours per day, it means that there's too much gas. The math doesn't work out. So what it actually is going to mean in reality is that when there's an LNG vessel coming next to this FSRU, they connect the pipelines and take away or withdraw or inject the LNG from this LNG tanker into that FSRU, and then the FSRU is planned to push everything into the grid. It means that some of it will stay in Finland, but most of it will actually go immediately down south to this Jukka's underground gas storage. So it will come from here or Paldiski down to Jukka's and fill the storage over there, and then it'll have some difficulties. So it's not an easy thing to manage now, unfortunately.
But do you see any supply problems this winter? Demand is falling quite heavily. Is there enough gas all the time, you think, to the Indian Ocean? With the current demand, I'm not expecting any difficulties in supplies. One thing, of course, is that as gas is so expensive and the cargoes that will arrive to this FSRU, one cargo is 1 terawatt hour of energy. 1 terawatt hour, that costs 200 million. So it's a lot of money. And I'm just kind of a bit worried that not that many companies have the cash to put on the side and wait for next month or following month before they can invoice them and sell to their customers. So that the combination of large size and the current price levels, the working capital tide is very intensive, and some of the bankers over here will get lots of calls. Yes, very uncertain. One quick question from the audience, if there's anyone. If not, we can just continue with the break, and then a 15-minute break, and then we will be back for the final session after that. So thank you very much, Jouni. Great. Then we have Mats Larsson, who comes from Axpo Nordic. They have been managing a lot of power purchase agreements in the Nordic market, and he will give us an update on what's going on in the market for PPAs. So, well to you, Mats.
I'm working as a senior originator in the Nordic market. I'm based in Oslo, but I work for all over the Nordic region. So thank you to the Montel team for inviting me here today and for hosting this Energy Day at this really lovely venue, I have to say. And I know that I'm in the last bulk, so I will not take too much of your time, since it's just me and one more presentation before the drinks. So my topic is PPA market development, and I will try to give a little bit more insight to you guys what PPA products that historically have been the most popular, what is traded mostly today, and also what type of risks that comes with those type of PPA products, not just for the seller but also for the buyer. And I mean, PPA products are a bilateral transaction. So if it's beneficial for the buyer and beneficial for the seller, it's just the imagination in some way that can set the boundaries. When I give you this presentation is from Axpo perspective, Axpo being a Swiss large generator, actually the largest generator in Switzerland, with approximately 35 terawatt hours of production during a normal year. We are a little bit over 100 years old, and we are owned actually by 7 cantons in the northern part of Switzerland, which is equal in a way to large municipalities as we know it. Axpo is local present in Europe. We have offices in over 30 countries in Europe. But we are also global now with the office in New York in the US and in Asia in Singapore. And the Asian office we managed to open just before the pandemic actually. So we are conducting, if we focus on Europe now, PPAs not only in the Nordic but also in the south of Europe, the western part of Europe as well as the eastern part of Europe. Axpo Nordic, there I work, was established in 2003, and we are doing origination business, and we back that with prop trading and also trading around those positions that the origination business delivers. We have a daughter company in here in Helsinki, in beautiful Finland. We have 2 people working there, also present here today, Harry and Lari. And we also have a daughter company in Malmö, Sweden. So by that mandatory slide about Axpo, I will move into the PPA structures in the Nordic market. And first, on the top level, I would like to distinguish between the corporate PPAs and the utility PPAs. Where if we start with the corporate PPA, that is a company that has a natural position in the market. They are short power, they would like to purchase power to secure a long-term power delivery, they would like to secure maybe a fixed price, and in some circumstances they're also interested in sort of the additionality, being able to prove that our PPA actually brought this new wind, if we take wind, facility to the market. And on the other hand, you have the utility PPAs. When Axpo is doing a PPA, we call it a utility PPA because we don't have any natural position in the Nordic market. So we are not out buying PPAs in order to secure any own consumption. We're delivering a product to a potential seller, telling them you can use this product and offset your risk. And of course that comes with a cost for the producer. So if we look into the more sort of standard structures then that are in this market, we have the pay-as-produce contract. Axpo Nordic started doing PPAs in the Nordic market back in 2010 approximately from wind power, and then the only PPA product that was discussed was actually the pay-as-produced. Pay-as-produced means that you pay a fixed price for a floating volume. Neither the seller nor the buyer knows how much volume that has been transacted. Of course, this then brings the risk of cannibalization that you probably know about. I will speak more about it later in my presentation. That is that your capture price is lower than the average price due to the fact that it's not just blowing in your wind farm, it's also blowing in the neighbor wind farm and the neighboring wind farm and so on. So that particular hour, it's a lot of production, making the price come down. So, but for 5-6 years at least, utilities was doing the pay-as-produced contracts, the corporates also, of course, but the pay-as-produced risk is a non-hedgeable risk. So when you have filled up your portfolio with the right amount of that risk, you are not interested in adding more of that risk. Therefore, 5-6 years ago, monthly baseload contracts started to get more popular. Letting the utility purchase a fixed price, fixed volume contract. And we structured that to have a monthly profile to be able to match the sort of expected production as good as possible. Then you also have the yearly baseload, which is the most sort of simple structure, where the facility actually sells just a yearly flat baseload for the whole term of the contract. But make no mistake that those fixed price, fixed volume contracts, the baseload contract, comes with the same amount of power for every hour. Inside the month for the monthly baseload and inside the year for the yearly baseload. So there is no floating volume inside a month. So it's fixed on an hourly basis. Then also there has always been, as I said, it's a bilateral market, so what fits the buyer and the seller, they can come to terms with. There are more complex structures. You have, for example, floor price, that the seller is receiving a floor from a buyer and the seller pays a premium for this. Then the seller can add a cap to the upside, financing the floor, and then you have the collar structure. Or you can have sort of a floor price that you receive from the buyer, and then you have some sort of shared upside. But all those more complex structures comes with usually optionalities. And when it comes with optionalities, you are subject to volatility. And when you're subject to volatilities, things start to get more expensive. So more or less all negotiation I have taken part in of those more complex structures, the project would like to have a price on this first. And when you deliver a price on those more complex structures, they pretty soon starts to realize that this is very expensive and maybe is not as a good hedge as we first thought. So, what are the risks that brings or comes with those PPAs? And those risks we are dividing in short term and also long term. Those risks are evident for not just the buyer, but also for the seller. But first, the first risk you sort of run into is the risk of non-construction. And what happens if we do a PPA is that we sign the PPA, typically close or on financial close. And then COD for the wind farm, when the park is getting operational, is somewhere, depending on what type of facility, of course, and how big it is, but at least 6 months to 1.5, 2 years ahead in time. Meaning that when you do a utility PPA, you sign the contract with the project owner, and then you turn around and you try to hedge the position that you have received. And then you have a time lag where something can happen that makes the wind farm getting delayed or actually non-constructed. We mitigate this risk by having sort of comforts. We call it pre-COD guarantees, which we need to have then from the project. When we do a PPA, you also end up with the balancing market. Someone needs to balance the facility. And if you do a utility PPA, physically, it's almost every time the utility that is taking care of the balancing responsibility. But be aware, if a project is doing a corporate PPA, it's not necessarily so that the corporate can do the balancing. So if you have a project and are going with a corporate PPA, make sure that you have someone that can do the balancing for you. You have the market price risk, of course, and that is the risk that the seller is offsetting by selling this. You have the volume risk, and this risk is more evident today than ever. And the volume risk is, for example, if the producer or the facility is selling a fixed price, fixed volume contract, typically or historically that has been sort of a project financed project. The bank tells them you need to sell 70% on a PPA, securing your income. All right, they sell 70% of their estimated production, but when they are producing, they are not producing that amount that they have sold. So they end up short, and they need actually to go out in the market and purchase back that power. And this has been, I mean, this is extremely costful when you have a market like we have today with really high prices and high volatility. This is also then connected to the cannibalization risk, which I already explained. And you have then also the liquidity risk. The bid and ask spread are getting wider, and the volume traders in the market are getting lower. The liquidity risk adds a higher discount on the PPA price if it's a utility that is the buyer. Then you have the model risk, that is that somehow the model that you use are wrong, and you have the credit risk. And of course the credit risk is very important, especially those days when more and more volumes are traded bilateral and prices are high. So those are sort of the main risks that I would like to sort of show you when you do a PPA. So how do we do it then? Well, Axpo purchases a long-term PPA from a single SPV. It might be then that this PPA is physical. We're also then taking care of the balancing responsibility for that particular wind farm. We then would like to try to sell parts of those volumes to corporates. We have constantly corporates that knocking on our doors wanting to purchase power. And then, I mean, the first reaction here when you see this picture is, oh, why don't corporate A, B, and C go directly to the SPV? And they do, if they are big enough for doing that. But not all can do that, and they also have different sort of different reasons for not going there. The first one being that they do not want to have the credit risk against an SPV. Second one can be that they don't have the same time horizon of the hedge they would like to purchase as the SPV would like to sell. Third one, can be the volume. The industrial or the corporate would like to purchase just 5 megawatts on a baseload yearly contract, while the wind farm needs to sell 20 megawatt profile baseload for 10 years. And the last one might be the transportation risk, where the wind farm is located maybe here in Finland, and the buyer is located somewhere else, maybe in SE4, SE3, NO2, whatever. So that is what we're trying to do first, and then we can also try to negotiate some sort of, is it possible to use marketing rights for the corporate? When is the PPA signed? Can they use the additionality? And always, more or less, the GOs are also part of a transaction like this. But this is not enough. I mean, we also need to use the Nasdaq term market and the OTC market to hedge these PPA risks that comes with the PPA. And when we turn to the Nasdaq term market, it has been introduced new parameters. And those are not new, but they are new to the masses, so to speak, because they have been more and more important to measure. And those are the value at risk and the initial margin for Nordic Power. First, the value at risk is sort of a risk measurement that is commonly used by traders and portfolio managers and also firms, which shows how much you can actually lose with that position that you have given a certain probability. And the initial margin is the margin you need to post as a cash to the clearing account when you do a cleared trades on the exchange. So this is two parameters that has increased a lot. Taking a look on the last 12 months for the value at risk, it has increased more or less with a factor by 7, and that is for the nearest quarter. So basically the risk, a 5 megawatt position in the nearest quarter has increased by 7 during those last 12 months. At the same time, the initial margin, the amount of cash you need to post if you do a trade like this, for the same time period has increased by a factor of 22. So for utilities, you can imagine that this is really expensive then. It's a lot of cash that you need to post if you want to offset risks in the cleared market. So, and this is also what we have seen. I mean, we have seen that the value at risk is actually making traders to decrease the position or close it out. And if value at risk is not doing that, the initial margin might do it. And that's also why several countries now are putting out large funds for energy generators to be able to draw at. So the risk then that we also see, or the trends, sorry, that we see in the financial market, because of this, of course, is there is decrease in liquidity. We see that the open interest is coming down, and the spread, the difference between bid and ask, are increasing, and are increasing a lot out on the curve. There is almost no existing liquidity on the EPADs, meaning that if you do a long-term PPA in a specific price area, it's very hard to hedge that using the cleared market. So there is increased transaction cost for hedging long-term transactions in this market, which then, of course, will put some more pressure on the pricing of the PPA. And also this increase in volatility, as you see on the lowest graph, you can see where the Cal 23 was traded 12 months ago, approximately at 50 euros. And now lately we have witnessed close to close in one day a movement of 42 euros. So that is a massive increase then also in volatility. So coming back a little bit to also, as I said earlier, regarding the BRP service. This is also something that is changing now in this market when the market is more volatile. And we heard earlier presentation, really good presentation from especially the Wind Association here in Finland, that we also see that a lot more capacity is coming into the market. But we also see, with a higher spot price, we also see the higher correlation between spot and regulating prices, the spread there is. Meaning that if you are wrong in your balancing, it will cost you more. And we see that increased wind capacity leads to increased need for regulating power. And this also then increases the spread. And that's why I said, if you have a project and you go for a corporate PPA, be sure that you have someone that can balancing your facility. And we have seen in the Finnish market, those two graphs are from Finland, that sometimes the regulating price has been almost 5,000 euros for a single hour. And we used to, when we sort of offered this BRP service, we used to do it to a fixed price. And then we have realized now that this is a massive risk that you actually take on for a very small revenue, and that revenue can be wiped out in just 1 hour, the whole yearly revenue. So we have now started not just offering BRP services for like 5 years that we did earlier. The tenors now are much shorter. We speak about 1, maybe 2 years. And we also start to index the price more to the spot price, sharing sort of the imbalancing cost with the project. So if the prices are high, they need to take more of that risk, and that's fine for most projects because they also earn more money than when prices are high in the sort of merchant production. So, coming a little bit closing in now on my presentation, the PPA risk development as we foresee it. The balancing market risk, yes, I just told you, is increasing significantly with high spot prices and installed capacity. And it will be really interesting. I mean, we saw presentations earlier from Olav Botnen that prices would come down, but still would stay quite high. So it will be interesting to see what's happening with this balancing market risk. We have the market price risk, with high initial margin and dropping liquidity. Long-term market risk is increasing, and it's difficult to manage. The volume risk, as I said, is a very sort of, you need to pay a lot of attention to it as a producer. And when we now say to a project if they would like to sell, we tell them you should sell like 40 to 50% of your estimated production instead of 70%. So that is something, I guess, that the projects need to start discussing also with the banks. You have the liquidity risk, and this is increasing due to dropping liquidity, and that makes then a little bit more discount on the pricing of the PPA. And it's extremely important to have a good overview over your credit risk. So this leads to shorter tenors. We see lower hedging ratio for fixed volume PPAs. We also see that the market tends to go to less complex structures. Higher liquidity cost and risk premiums then leads to lower PPA price. And we also, not in the Nordics, but we know about projects further south, at least they started to discuss, that it might be possible for the utility and the SPV to share the initial margin burden. And we also see then increased BRP costs and shorter fixed price tenors. But still, I would like to end this presentation with that still there is a vital, and it is a very exciting PPA market. And I would say that nowadays, players in this market has much more knowledge, and that goes not just for the utilities, but also for the corporates. So they know about those risks. They know how to price it correctly. So this is very positive. And I mean, as we know, it has to be more electrification in society. And then the PPAs will still play, will have a major role in sort of making this happen. And PPA helps to advance this energy transition because they also then provide an incentive for investors to invest in this field of renewable energy. So by that, I'm ending my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mats. I think we are running a bit behind schedule, so I think we would just skip the Q&A session. Mats will be here to talk to you afterwards.
Yep.
So then we just go straight to Outi Hempere, who is a project director for sustainable solution at Sitra, who is a independent public fund and think tank. And you can maybe explain better than me what you are doing in your presentation. So you will focus on the EU ETS carbon market and also some of the EU reforms that are now being discussed in Brussels.
Yes, thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here. So my name is Outi. I lead a project called Sustainability Solutions for the Economy at Sitra. Sitra is a public fund directly under the Finnish Parliament. And what we're doing at our team is to find solutions how to integrate natural capital. And by natural capital, I mean both the living and non-living nature, including, for example, climate. How to integrate natural capital into our economic decision making. And just a few words about Sitra. We are Finland's future house. So one thing what we are doing is to try to make people understand that there is not only one future, it's not a destiny that we are walking into, but we can decide what kind of future we want and make, and there are different possibilities for the kind of future outcomes. And we've been discussing here the energy crisis, but I just would like to remind that there's also a climate crisis, and actually these crises are interlinked, and we need to halve the global emissions by 2030 if we want to limit the global heating to 1.5 degrees. And we already are 3 years into this decade, so the urgency is there. And EU ETS is the cornerstone of EU climate policy, so we cannot talk about EU climate policy without addressing the EU ETS. But the discussions around EU ETS, they don't happen in a vacuum. There are two drivers that I'm pointing here. One is the EU climate law that entered into force back in 2021. So we are aiming to be climate neutral by 2050, and we are aiming to reduce emissions at least by 55% by 2030. And another major issue around us is the energy crisis that we have heard today. And the issue here is, will it advance the energy transition, or what kind of impact it will have on the energy transition? Just a few words whether or not the EU ETS has worked in the past. The emissions under the EU ETS have decreased by 37% since it started back in 2005. So that's a major outcome and much better compared to the sectors not regulated by the EU ETS. So we can say that it's been a success, although we all know that it's not the only factor contributing to this outcome. For example, the Renewable Energy Directive and energy efficiency measures have also contributed to this outcome. Then about the price. There was a long discussion about the low price and the price not incentivizing industry to invest in low energy and low carbon solutions. But it has increased since the agreement was made on the MSR, Market Stability Reserve. The agreement was made in 2018. Since then, there has been an upward trend in the price. And there has been a few drops, such as the start of the pandemic and the start of the war in Ukraine. There was a lot of uncertainty, what will happen to the economy, what will happen to the market, but the price has always recovered. However, this time series stops at the end of August, and we have now seen that actually the futures are trending much lower, and I think the spot prices today are around 65 euros or so. So there has been a big drop, and I will come to this later. In addition to the price, it's one signal when we think about whether the system is working or not. Another signal is the TNAC, total number of allowances in circulation. And this is an indicator that the Commission publishes every May, and just tell us how many allowances there are still circulating that have not been cancelled against emissions. And the number is still high, even after the start of the Market Stability Reserve. It's almost 1.5 billion allowances, and that's higher than the total annual emissions under the sector. So it's still a very high number. And one reason for this is that every year the emissions under the EU ETS have been lower than the cap, and due to this difference, the TNAC has been accumulating. So there was in 2021, July 2021, there was a Commission's proposal how to reform the EU ETS. And when we look at the proposal, we can try to address or evaluate it based on, for example, these questions. Is the ambition level right? Are the key measures to tighten the EU ETS, are they about right? Are they justified? What's the new scope of the EU ETS? Has the scope been altered? What is the new role of the emissions trading scheme for the road transport and buildings? And also, what's the link between the EU ETS and the CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism? And I just would like to point that the views that I'm presenting here, they are based on this study that we released back in 2019, a study that included a proposal how to reform the EU ETS to align it with the Paris Agreement. And I'm sure this is something quite familiar to you, so let me just go through this very quickly. Commission proposed an ambition level of 61% emission reduction against 2005 levels. The current target is 43%, so that's an 18 percentage point increase. And that is actually exactly the same number that we proposed in our study if you aim at a total ambition level of 55% emission reduction by 2030. And we also proposed that that level of ambition should be achieved both increasing the linear reduction factor and rebasing the cap, which means a one-off reduction to the cap. And we also proposed that the market stability reserves, the rules for the MSR should be tightened, for example, continuing the higher intake rate of 24%. And then I think it's justified the inclusion of maritime transport to the system from 2026 onwards. Maritime sector is a sector without any price signal thus far, so I think it's justified. And also, probably one of the biggest political negotiation points is now this separate emission trading scheme for the road transport and buildings. And I think it's justified that it's a separate system, so it's not integrated to the existing system. So that's one point. But then the second point is that, okay, what will the concerns are that what will happen to the consumer prices when the inflation rate is already so high, and also there is concern that we know that the price signal itself is not enough to reduce emissions in these sectors, so we need a comprehensive package to address the emissions. And attached to this new emission trading scheme is the Social Climate Fund. So it's a whole. The debate is actually very political and quite difficult at the moment. So the EU Parliament has also now taken its stance regarding the proposition from the Commission. They actually saying that the ambition level should be a little bit higher, 63% emission reduction by 2005. And Parliament is also saying that we should limit the participation of speculators in the market. And my understanding is that there hasn't been much evidence that the speculators have caused any harm or have been behind this peak of the price peak. And now the Commission they are investigating whether kind of limiting the participation would actually cause any harm to the market. And regarding the new emission trading scheme for transport and buildings, the Parliament is saying that only the commercial part of this should be included in the scheme, and that is probably quite difficult to manage in practice. What's happening next? There will be the trilogy negotiations, and maybe there will be smoke some end of next year, early next year, smoke coming up. And just to remind that this is the reform of the EU ETS is you need a qualified majority voting in the Council, so that's roughly 15 member states. And then outlook for the future. These crises, the energy crisis and the climate crisis, are interlinked. But we know that what is causing the current energy crisis is not the energy transition, it's actually the imbalance between the demand and supply of affordable energy. That's been said many times in this room today. And if that's the root cause, then trying to address the problem through the carbon market is probably not the right way forward. And if you try to weaken the carbon market and weaken the EU ETS, that might actually weaken the investment environment and then delay the energy transition that is so much needed in the Europe. So I would be very careful here to touch the carbon market. We also already heard today some price projections for the EU ETS. And now in the title, when I say that there has been the forecasts are up, this is actually in July. And now I mentioned that the price has been coming down, and I'm waiting now. I think Reuters should be anytime soon publish their new forecast, because still in July they were forecasting for next year almost allowance price of close to 100, and then 2024 over 100. And now it's interesting to see whether that still holds or what's the new reality. But in general, bull factors are, of course, this tightening of the market, although one might argue that some of this is already, of course, realized in the market prices. But then the downside, the bear factors, is, for example, this possible economic recession in Europe. What if industry factors being closed in Europe, the demand for allowances goes down dramatically, or this industry selling their allowances, and also from the supply, any increase, unexpected increase in the supply of allowances will of course weaken the price and the market. I was asked very quickly to address the proposal that's being discussed tomorrow at the Energy Council. And I think here probably the most interesting part is the electricity emergency tool. And there is this invitation to save energy, and we have heard so many times in this room today that actually saving energy is probably the only easy way out of this crisis. And there is Commission is hoping a 5% reduction in the peak hour demand and a 10% reduction in the overall demand. And this is for now for the member states to think how to address this. I would like to mention that in Finland we have this Astetta Alemmas campaign starting at 10th of October. So that's for citizens a campaign for citizens to save energy. But of course, companies and organizations are warmly welcomed as well. And then we already discussed a little bit this cap on the market revenues for electricity generation. And this is for the inframarginal technologies such as nuclear and renewables. And of course, this is not addressing the high prices as such. It's a way to I guess, to raise funds to try to help, for example, consumers. And we already heard that the devil is in the detail, how to actually implement this in practice. Commission is saying that it wouldn't hurt the investment environment, but how to actually, in a very short period of time, how to come up with the rules and implement it is probably a challenging thing. And the kind of discussions regarding pricing the cap on putting a cap on electricity price, or trying to kind of differentiate between the electricity generated by gas from other sources of electricity generation, those discussions are still ongoing. This is just from energy. I think that's...
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah. I think that's good. We may have. Is there one question for Oti? If not, we can just conclude by saying that it's very good to have you here, all the other speakers, and I think will you also be here later so they can ask you questions also?
I can stay a little bit.
Yeah, after the presentation.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes. And then I'll leave it for Morten to just give some practical details before we end the session today.
So on that we close and enjoy each other's hospitality and friendship the rest of the evening. And thanks to all of you, and see you during the evening, and enjoy. Thank you so much.